Hi everyone, I'm Saranya. I run the Bombay Poetry Crawl and I'm back with a new podcast episode this month featuring an interview with Arundhathi Subramaniam. Arundhathi Subramaniam needs no introduction. She's a fantastic poet, writer, essayist, cultural commentator, and just all in all a fantastic human being, someone that I'm very privileged and fortunate to know. So, in this episode, we talked about everything from the early days of her writing to what she's currently working on, breaking down her poetic style, as well as delving into what the city means to her, how she puts together anthologies of poetry and essays. So, enjoy. Hi, Arundhati. Thank you so much for agreeing to chat with me. Um, how are you? Where are you right now? You're in New York, right?
I'm in New York on a very chilly spring morning.
It's chilly.
It's chilly. It shouldn't be, but it is. It's rainy. It's rainy.
Oh, I wish it was raining.
And I don't usually have a problem with rain because it takes me right back to Mumbai. But, it could be warmer.
How long have you been there
But I'm glad. I've been here. I came here end March. So I've been here a while, a little more than a month now.
That's nice. And you spoke about the Bombay rains. It's very hot now over here and it's not started raining yet. But but that gets me into the first question, which is a lot is being said about the Bombay poet, what the Bombay poet means. And I'm realizing that it's a term that's quite contentious as well as I think also practical for researchers and academics. As someone who is sometimes often referred to as a Bombay poet, how do you feel about that phrase?
I'm not averse to it any more than I'm averse to the idea of being called a woman poet. That's not my only identity, but it's an important part of my identity. So I'm not averse to it. And I think these can be useful labels. But I can also see why they can turn contentious, because sometimes they can be perceived as a little clique of self-congratulatory folk sitting around patting each other on the back. So let me say from the start, that is not what I have known. So that has not been my experience. But I can see why from the outside it could be perceived as such. So as far as I'm concerned, I was born in Bombay and I grew up there, I studied there, I worked there, I grew into an adult there. And so it was inevitable that I had conversations with and interactions with many of the writers in the city, because that was really what I was drawn to. Words were what I was drawn to.
Yeah.
And even as I met those writers, and there were so many from across languages, really, and there were novelists and poets, and there was Shanta Gokhale, there was Kiran Nagarkar, there was Nissim, Ezekiel, Adil Jasawala, Giv Patel, Imtiaz Dharkar, so many. And there was Eunice D'Souza, who was my professor at St. Xavier's. There was Vilas Sarang, who was my professor in my MA years. There was the Poetry Circle, where I met my contemporaries like Jerry Pinto and, Ranjit Hoskote. So many. There were the Gujarati poets, Prabodh Parekh and Naushil Mehta, the playwright, and Kamal Vora. There were the Marathi poets. There were just so many. There was Dilip Chitre. There was Arun Kolatkar. It was a city of ferment, literary ferment. But let me say that did I feel I belonged? No. So for those who think it's a kind of cozy club membership, it wasn't. My second book of poems was called Where I Live. And that was really meant to indicate, at least for me, the gap between where I live and where I belong. Mm-hmm. I wasn't quite sure where I belonged. And I'm not sure I still know it, though I may have a sort of clearer idea of where I don't belong. So, that sense of that gap was what the book returned to measuring in one way or the other, culturally, politically, geographically, spiritually, what it meant to belong or unbelong.
Yeah.
So, I think I find the Bombay poet label useful if it indicates a kind of, by historical accident, people who happen to interact with each other and were energized by the polyglottal, multicultural ethos of the city, and who valued a poetry that was modern and innovative and responsive to the world they lived in, and the world the poetry was birthed in, but at the same time was very deeply concerned with issues of craft and formal rigor. So to me, if it broadly indicates that, yes, but it certainly wasn't any kind of, it wasn't a club, it wasn't a school, none of that. I will say this, that the further I journey from Bombay, oddly enough, and the more I consider other people to be my literary influences, the paradox is that the epithet of Bombay poet returns. There are many who consider me primarily a Bombay poet, and that interests me, and I don't disown the label.
I'm very fascinated by the number of people that you mentioned whom you were surrounded by, whether in just literary terms, or who were your teachers, or whom maybe there was some sort of exchange of ideas that was happening. So what was your personal journey like into writing, into growing as a poet? And did some major part of that happen in the city or outside of the city?
I think the city really was formative, which is why I don't disown the label of Bombay poet. It was formative. It was where I began to realize just how passionate I was about poetry.
Yeah.
The city is where I read my first Arun Kolatkar poem. I remember reading Jejuri, sitting in a little alcove in the St. Xavier's College library and being blown away by it. And not necessarily being curious about, does Arun Kolatkar live here? Not that. But the city is where I encountered the poetry. And to me, that made a difference. The city is where I first read Keki Daruwala. The city is where I first encountered Eunice D'Souza. So it became an important, I think it shaped me in ways that I probably don't even, very deep ways. And later I was part of what was called the Poetry Circle for many years, where many of us met each other, younger poets from different parts of the city. We gravitated there once every fortnight. We were all a bit verse infatuated and, not quite knowing. We knew we were terribly inconsequential in the city we lived in, for having this bizarre passion. So it was the time when poetry was still very, very marginal, very dowdy. And that was nice in a way. We just sort of crept into that, the space that was at Kala Ghoda and then later at the PEN. That's where we met. That's when Nissim was an important part of many of our lives. I remember going across with him to have Dudi Halwa at Sanman and showing him a poem and, waiting for his response. And so I think it was a time of ferment without us knowing it. We never had any sense of cultural consequence. We were just a bunch of very, very people who I considered myself terribly peripheral to the city. And I still do, But you felt gradually, looking back, I realized that a sense of community was growing. And thanks to that, one met many of the other older poets.
Yeah.
There were conversations that happened and some deepened. Some didn't.
Some didn't as well.
Of course, some did.
It's not always as romantic as we imagine it.
Not at all. It wasn't some, and I want to say that it wasn't some sort of cartel, of you have to get into it and then you belong. I realized more and more that when I was a younger poet, maybe in my 20s, you're constantly trying to belong.
Yeah.
You are looking for, and I still see this, I see this anxiety play itself out in many people, young and old. You see it on social media.
Yeah.
I know these people talk to me, these people write to me, these people like my work. So you are trying very hard to belong as a younger poet, and I certainly did. So I wanted, the poetry circle was something I thirsted for because you wanted your own little niche there. But you realize, I think, growing up and growing older, that the less you try to belong, often the more you do. That was my recognition. The more you are yourself, the more, in fact, in some way, there is this place for you. But the more you try to fit in, it's an act of great violence to the self. And I think the sooner, people grow out of it, the better.
And was this something that you perhaps were conscious of when you were writing Where I Live? Or how did that collection of poems come about? Since we're talking about belonging and not belonging.
Yes, that's a good question. Where I Live was my second book. My first book on cleaning bookshelves had already been published in 2001, and Where I Live happened in 2005. Many of the poems in the first book were written in the 90s, but a lot of the poems in Where I Live happened in the first 5 years of 2000, the millennium. Yeah, I was very aware of the tensions, the kind of unease, the ambivalence I felt, trying to fit in, never quite fitting in. I said in a particular book later, book of prose, that I felt often that I was a trapezium while everyone else was a round peg in a round hole. And then I realized, of course, growing up, that everyone feels that way. But and then you also realize that there is room for trapeziums in the world.
Yeah.
So I think once I grew a little accustomed to my trapeziumhood, things got easier. But the poems there reflect that tension, and I like that tension. It's a book I go back to. I still read from that book at readings because I like the tension, and I think a lot of the poetry was born of that sense of unease, of ambivalence. And this is very much at the heart of my relationship also with the city. I have a complicated relationship with the city. I don't love the city, but the further I journey from it and the more I try to escape it, the more I long to return. So that paradox is also there at the heart of that book.
Yeah, I'm finding this a lot, especially with people who work in the city or whose work is connected to thinking about Bombay, which is that a lot of us are pretty sick of it, or we're always sick of it, and we can't wait to leave. And we're always thinking of it from the outside. So sometimes that's easier than actually being in here with the potholes and everything. Which then, like the title poem of yours, and I realized that I've read poems from Where I Live and not the whole collection at once, because in my research of reading about poems from Bombay, I've come across a few of the poems. But the title poem itself, just how it refers to, say, a wedge of land reclaimed from the ocean, sort of reminded me of Melanie Salgado's poem Bombay. Reclaim your cunt from time to time and let the sea rush into you. Or even how you write about greetings from the city of L'Oreal sunsets, that naming of the brand, it reminded me a bit of Altaf Tayarwala's Ministry of Hurt Sentiments with the way he writes. Thank God for Monday mornings and, the industry, the capital of Bombay, of it all. Can you tell me a little bit more about that title poem? Because I felt like it was in a language that I could really access and understand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, yes, there is all the hysteria of advertisement that we see all around us. I was traveling from Warsaw all the way to South Bombay on a fairly regular basis because I worked at the NCPA, so that the claustrophobia, the intolerable self-importance of the city, that's part of it.
Yeah.
And at the same time, there is also the sense of its utter marginality. That's why it's a city somewhere at the edge of the world, universe. That's the first line. And that's where I come from. I usually read it nowadays to introduce myself to audiences. This is who I am. This is where I come from. Yeah, I come from a city somewhere at the edge of the universe. And then there was this feeling of, of course, I was aware of many city poems before me, and they were probably part of the whole knapsack of echoes that I carry around with me. There was Nissim, certainly, the island, unsuitable for sound as well as sense. There was, I'd read Nissim and Arun and Adil, all of that. But for me, it came out of that sense of, one, the inseparability of the city from all the cultural baggage that it was loaded with. And then there were the riots of 92, 93, and that whole period. So, I realize now that when I read those lines towards the end of the poem, it came from that very deep sense of disquiet that followed that. The lines go, city of dark alleys, city of mistrust, city of forsaken tube-lit rooms, city that coats the lungs, stiffens the spine, chills the gut with memory. Comes straight from that period. I can still recall it now in my body when I read those lines.
Yeah, and the fact that the riots of 92, 93 happened, and some of the worst communal tensions all over the country after Babri Masjid demolition happened right after the economy opened up in 91. And I think that jarring, um, it seems like it should be a contradiction, but it's not. So to have L'Oreal, this, international brand that represents this public economy, along with the dark alleys that you talk about, did you feel like you were writing to sort of try to reconcile these two very different phenomena happening in India at the time, or Bombay?
I'm sure. I mean, the way I see it now, looking back, Saranya, clearly it was a world it was a country in the throes of great change.
Yeah.
And we were bewildered trying to make sense of it. You suddenly picked up the Bombay Times and you heard of a film star attending a party with Bill Clinton, and it was I'm thinking of that entire decade and a half, the 90s to 2005. When I look at it, it was a strange time. It was incongruities that seemed to they seemed incongruous to us because that was not the world we lived in prior to that. So yes, much changed. And one was trying to make sense of it, but also I'm not sure one sits down and says, how do I reconcile liberalization with the world I live in? That's not how you're just wandering through, trying to make sense of this assault on the one hand, of this whole blitzkrieg of advertising, for instance, that had started happening. And you're trying to make sense of that with your earlier sense of neighborhood. All that, the sense of the local had changed.
Which I think I'm suddenly, like, that just makes me think of what it's like right now in this day and age. I try to get my news just by reading the newspaper every morning, but I'm scrolling on Instagram like every hour. I know that I'm hit with a barrage, like you said, a blitzkrieg of advertisement and news and, trauma and then dancing and all of this. And I feel like some of the anxieties that I find in that poem are stuff that we find even today. But I wanted to ask you, so you said that you would take the train every day from Warsaw to NCP, so I'm assuming Churchgate, and that just and that reminds me. Sorry?
That seemed pretty intense. Even 3 times a week or 4 times a week seemed pretty intense that time.
Would you take the fast or the slow?
I take the Andheri. There was I think I take sometimes I took the fast. Andheri had a fast, but there were times you took the slow and got off in Vele Padle and tried to make your way back.
Yeah, which of course reminds me of 546 Andheri local. And I must tell you this. So we read the poem and a few of the crawls that I organize, but I have this one crawl which is called the ladies local, and we sort of sit in a ladies compartment train, and this is open to anyone who identifies as a woman because that's what we find in the women's compartment. And we read a bunch of poets from Bombay, female poets, mostly in Marathi and some in English. But this poem is what everyone always comes back to again and again. And everyone who has read it with me in the train especially enjoys it, especially being in that moment. And we feel that, the acetylene and, the mixed metals that you talk about and, the sweat and all of that. So I have to ask about that poem.
That poem is from my first book, and I'm amazed at, it seems to have traveled to strange places. I found someone in, reading it to me in Romanian. And I was just thinking, how on earth did this poem connect with someone there? But I suppose it's something about, I'm glad you're reading it on a train because that's really where it was birthed. how did that happen? It's from my first book, so it must have been written in the 90s when I moved in the 90s from South Mumbai to Versova in the mid 90s, and I think even now. What I relate to in that poem is, one, it's very distilled, and the other, it captures again the sense of deep distaste, real repugnance, this idea of just being really squashed, isn't it?
Yeah.
Dreams, disasters, germs, destinies, flesh and organza, odors, ovaries, all of that. And at the same time, even while there is that sense of recoil, there's also a sense of freedom and empowerment, which comes from that being part of a collective, the Kali on wheels. So there is a simultaneous sense, I think, in that poem, which I like, of being acted upon and acting, both. So I'm not just a victim of the city, though I sometimes feel like one. On occasion, I have agency too. On occasion, the city, big bully that it is, does agree to share terms with me,
And the poem, the line that says, we saw in the women's compartment of a local train, we search for no personal epiphanies. That line reminds me of Geet Patel's poem from Bombay Central, in which he talks about how, I can't remember the exact words, but it ends with how after all
heraldic clouds of light that come through. So suddenly there's a sense that Bombay Central is capable of bringing in these almost, some divine, some great sense of revelation.
Yeah, which at the end, he's sort of like, it's really funny because he turns that on his head, and perhaps even the idea of, poetry being divine and giving us all of these answers is turned on its head, and it's turned very mundane. So I think that really stood out to me.
There's both going on actually in that poem, Saranya. There's both. There is there's a sense of the minutiae of life in that Geet Patel poem that you mentioned. There's those parle glucose wrappers, and then there's that sense of the smell coming off hot steel, and those stone. What is it? Just the sense again of being very, very crammed. Yeah. But then there are those heraldic shafts of light. So it's an interesting counterpoint as well.
That is true. That is very true. And this might be a presumptuous question, but why did Kali come to you while writing this poem?
I have no idea. And honestly, when I look, I have no idea. And I know that this was in my first book, and there's another goddess who comes in there who, again, I had no clue would enter, and that is Madurai Meenakshi. She enters a poem called Madurai. And I don't know why they entered. I made sense to some degree. I felt I was formally introduced to my understanding of the goddess much later in my life. But I suppose Kali comes in as this fearsome, terrifying being, but who is also full of power. To me, that sense of the empowered female archetype perhaps is what I was looking for unconsciously.
Yeah. I can either dice carrots or dice a lover. I postponed. I could choose to dice carrots or like. I postponed the latter. Amazing.
Yes.
The other day I was in a train. I was in a really packed, and oh my God, the 6 p.m. Andheri local is one I try to avoid at all costs because it's hell. But the one that's worse than that is now the 6 p.m. Virar fast. And I was unfortunately on that train. It was horrible, Arundhati, and I was in it, and obviously these two women started fighting, and obviously one of them was cutting vegetables. She picks up her knife and she starts attacking the other woman. She's like, "Main maregi tere ko." And I was like, just keep me out of this place. I was kind of in the middle, and I'm so scared. I immediately thought of your poem, and I was like, just don't dice me, please.
I know. There are people with implements that can cause much harm, much injury. Yeah, it is. When I turned 40, here's an admission, a personal admission. When I turned 40, I decided no more Bombay trains for me. So I've just stopped taking Bombay trains after that. Never mind if there's no poem that will come of it. That's fine with me.
Yeah, it's fine. It becomes a life and death question, to be really honest.
Yeah.
Just the other
Very
day,
often.
just 2 days ago, my friend got off at Marine Drive and he said that he saw a dead body in the track. Someone just died. So it's actually life and death.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It is. It is. And which is why I sort of resist attempts to romanticize that too much, because there's a great deal of, uh, that kind of congestion. Yes, it's amazing that Bombay endures, but I think there are also many, many stories of great pain. And, those are not documented adequately.
Yeah, which then also reminds me of, this whole idea of, oh, like the spirit of Bombay that's glorified so much. But people who've actually lived in the city have seen so much, and you've seen so much in all of these decades. And, not just with the riots, but with the turn of the century, with this boom in industry, the stock market, with technology growing, the film industry, and the pandemic. And I see how, life in the 90s and perhaps the early 2000s played in your work. But does present Bombay come up in your current writing?
That's a good question. I wonder. Actually, yes. I think if I look back on my, just the book that was out in 2019 in India and 2020 in the UK, that is Love Without a Story, I
Yeah.
realized that Mitti, for instance, there's a monsoon poem. So perhaps the more elemental aspects of Bombay. I've always felt that what rescued me when I was in Bombay was the sea. Just the glimpse of the sea, even in a distance, kept me going very often. The monsoons, earth, the smell of earth. So I think I return to those things more deeply now. The rest of the time, I felt I was always in the earlier work. I was wrestling all the time with this, what I call my messy subcontinent of demons.
Yeah.
So it's not that the demons don't exist. It's just that I perhaps um, navigate the city somewhat differently in my heart.
It's so interesting that you go back to perhaps, the fundamental elements like water and earth and air.
Yes.
Um, and moving a little bit away now from Bombay, but also speaking of yourself and Jerry Pinto, one of the first books of yours the earliest book of yours that I think I own, and I don't own where I live, is I own Confronting Love, which is a collection that you edited with Jerry. And it's so fun to read that because it's small. It's a pocket book, and sometimes I just take it with me, and I've read it, when I'm traveling or when I have like some long distance work or things like that to do. And it's just so heartwarming to read. How did that collection come together?
Hmm. Actually, I don't remember when the idea struck us, but I know that, Jerry and I, we've known each other many years now. We were together in the poetry circle. We've been very good friends. So we actually used to meet at one point just to sit together. We'd call it our day of poetry. We'd just sit together and read poems. And we'd bring to that meeting lots of books that we owned,
Yeah.
and or poems we'd just read. And somewhere as you're reading poems to each other, it's talking about what you like. I think the need to map the scene the way you see it, that perhaps started to grow. So I don't remember very much of the process, but what I do remember is much joy in the act of mapping something, differently. And I really still feel we need so many anthologies, city anthologies, um, uh, you know, um, like this, a love anthology. There's so many ways in which we can map the scene, and I did some of that later in the Poetry International web as well. But I think I remember joy. I remember much laughter, which is often typical around Jerry. And the other thing I remember is lots of masala chai, which I was the author. That I remember. But yeah, I think we would have perhaps liked to make it a big baggy anthology, but it ended up being a slim pocketbook one. And
Yeah.
I think that kind of works.
Yeah, books, laughter, and masala chai seems like three things that can be written about love. But I'm so interested. You said that it's an act of mapping, is what putting together a collection is. And what is it like mapping love? Because I remember when I started reading the book, I realized that I, for instance, shy away so much in my own writing using the word love because it's just so loaded in my opinion. It's very difficult to write about in a new and original way. But I found that these poems just had me so surprised, so many of them. So, um, how did you choose love as a theme?
Probably because, now that I think about it, many years ago when we were all part of the circle, we'd sometimes give ourselves exercises to do in the circle. And one of the exercises we once set ourselves is now write, a love poem. So then we all sat obediently and wrote, and then
That's
we went back.
terrifying.
I know it was terrifying. And I thought I wrote a couple of reasonably good ones. We were allowed to go home and rework it too. But then I remember we'd pass it around to each other, or we'd read it as well, read it aloud. And now that I think of it, I realized that a lot of my love poems ended up being rage poems, and that had something to do with the fact that clearly I was not, there was much that was unexpressed and was edgy and enraged. So that was happening. And so it obviously was apparent in the poetry. It also, of course, one was resisting the cliches of love, which I think most of us are aware of. In poetry, you don't want, I always give the example when I'm doing a workshop with students, I always give them the example of Shakespeare talking about a mistress's eyes being nothing like the sun. So you're very aware of the sentimentality and the goo of love poetry.
Yeah.
And I want to resist that. So there is also that. But I do remember Jerry once writing in the margins of one of my poems when, we would pass it around to each other. And he wrote, now sit, very nice, now sit down and write an honest to goodness love poem. So I thought it was a love poem, So maybe it had its beginnings in that, the fact that we, realize that it's really hard to write a love poem. I think I've written many subsequently, but I chose to put in a poem called Vigil into this book, which came from my experience of classical dance, the archetype of the pining woman waiting for her paramour, and the reality of my own existence, which understands what that pining is about, but which also knows that this is finite. So, she says at the end, the speaker in the poem at the end says, I will wait, but only until the light fades, no longer than that.
That just really stayed with me. You say that this you were reading together and writing together, and it sounds really fun, to be honest. I'm really jealous that I wasn't around for the poetry circle meeting. So tell me a little bit about that. How did the poetry circle come alive?
I mean, it was already in existence. It had started, I think, in the late 80s. I went to it 86, I think. I went to it in 1989 is when I went for my first meeting, or maybe a little earlier. I was 19 when I went.
Oh, so you hadn't
that.
started it?
No, it was started earlier. It was started, in fact, Menka Shivdasani was one of the founding members of it, along with a bunch of others.
But sorry, were you not hosting these readings at Prithvi, I think?
Yeah, all that happened much later. This was in the late 80s that it started. I was still a student in Xavier's, madly in love with poetry, but, I wanted some place where I could share the work and get feedback. So I went to it as a young girl at the age of 19. Later, in my MA years, I became much more intensely part of the circle. We had a kind of breakaway group, some of us, called Fringe, which was also exciting. So we had... when I look back on that time, Saranya, what I remember is we were lots of young, angular people, edgy people, reasonably bright people, more than reasonably bright sometimes, maybe, on a good day. But we were also... there was a great intensity, and which has to go with any act of creative writing, and it wasn't always harnessed the way it should be. So there were arguments and there were tensions, all that goes with people coming together, and very diverse, temperamentally very diverse people coming together. But there were also friendships.
Yeah.
And the one thing I know, and the good thing about that time, when I look back on it, though I wasn't aware of it then, is that we really had conversations about poetry. We were not talking about where to be published. A lot of our conversations, and I realized this because I've subsequently encountered many, I've done workshops and all of that, where a question, they want a whole hour set aside for how to be published. And oddly, that was not our concern. Our concern was really how to write a poem that seems to work, and what is it that makes that poem work, but my poem doesn't seem to hold together. So we were trying to really arrive at our own understanding of how form functioned in one poem after the other. So we were reading a lot, we were arguing a fair amount, and we were also drinking lots of chai at Saranya. And later we would go to Stadium, which was the Irani Cafe
at
near
Wankhede.
Churchgate.
Yeah.
Yeah. Lots of omelette sandwiches, and I think some had keema pao, and we would have conversations continued well after the circle meeting was over. And as always, that's where a lot of you need to marinate a little in poetry for you to create your own poetry. At least at that time, it helped enormously. So I recommend to everyone, especially when there are younger people who sometimes ask, what do you suggest should be the next step? I often recommend having a writer's group and allowing yourself to critique each other's work. And it has to be constructive critique, but you need that before you send your poem out into the ether.
And did that experience give rise to what you started, which I think it's Cafe Rati? I'm sorry, I forgot the name.
No, Cafe Rati was, I think, started by Peter Griffin much later. So what happened after the Poetry Circle meetings began to sort of die down at one point I think it was in the late 2000s or in the 90s. All of us were busy, working professionals really by then. And for a while, Jerry and I continued those. We found a space and we continued hosting. I sent out mailers. That's all that was really what we did. We sent out mailers and told people to come. And they came and we would just sit and talk poetry. It was one way of keeping a certain lubrication going for ourselves too. So there was that happening. That continued in the early 2000s. But I was also running Chauraha. That was what I did at the NCPA. And we had lots of work in progress, discussing work in progress in poetry and doing readings. We did a lot of those there. Later, Adil started loquations on Tuesdays at the Chauraha Sunken Garden. Those were not Chauraha events, but it was the Sunken Garden. I used to handle the formal Chauraha events, insofar as they can be called formal. They were to my mind, very informal. But Adil had these weekly soirees, in a sense, but it was out in the open in the Sunken Garden. So then the Poetry Circle, it wasn't, so it just morphed. When I look back now, I think it just keeps morphing into the avatars that make sense to a different generation. I was so busy with Chauraha. After a point, Poetry Circle fizzled out, but other kinds of groups came together. But I think looking back, it was an important moment in the city's literary history, because I know many people from there who've continued to be very deeply committed to writing, even if not to poetry. There were so many, very deeply committed to writing. Sorry?
No, sorry.
Yeah. No, I think of so many. I'm thinking of people like, apart from Ranjit or Jerry, there was Gayatri Majumdar, there was Abhay Sardesai, there was Anju Makhija. There were just so many, many who continued in one way, either working in translation or working in fiction, or, there was Derek Antal who wrote plays. There were just many, many people who I think were invigorated, at least, if not influenced, by the circle.
But another way that I feel like I owe you a big thank you is for your work with Poetry International, because let me tell you, I had to speak to the poet Salma, and my reading of Tamil is terrible. And I have her books of poems because my family has them. And, it would take me like a really long time to decide. And also her Tamil is really hard. Like it's very like Sutta Tamil. It's very literary.
Yes.
And so to have to have her poems on Poetry International with the translations, and this was before the book came out, I, Salma, that Red River had published, I was able to actually access her work and speak to her better. So, and not just her, but so many other poets, Indian poets that we didn't have access to coming from India, which is insane. Um,
Absolutely.
what was that work like? And first of all, thank you so much for doing that. But what was it like? How?
Yeah, it turned out to be quite, when I look at it, I think I can say that it was truly a bit of a monumental effort, because I look back and I realize we have 636 poets in 19 languages. So
Wow.
it was a very, very concerted effort to make things inclusive without being indiscriminate as far as possible. So it took a lot of work, but it was pleasurable. And I think my main challenge when I first took it on with great trepidation in 2003, it started in 2004, I think, but 2003 is when I formally took it on. I started with trepidation because how on earth do you map a scene as diverse as India? You know, all the languages. I thought I would never do a good job. I gave it up. I said no to the people who
What?
proposed the Poetry International Web. I thought it was going to be impossible to do, and I would just win many enemies, and that would be it, because it seemed an unmappable scene. And then I realized there's only one way to do it, which is to just take it step by step. Listen to the poets whose work excites you. Start putting that together. So it was an act of it was there was no grandiosity in the process of putting it together, but gradually it kind of burgeoned into something much larger than I had ever anticipated. So looking back on it, I think it plays a role for two reasons. I have met so many poets, writers, and readers internationally who found poets whose work they love in that archive. So it plays a role in presenting Indian poetry of a time to the world. And the other thing I think it does is something that I learned in my years as a curator, as a writer, as a listener, that the greatest compliment or the greatest award you can give a poet is the act of listening. Mm-hmm. Just listen deeply and honor them with the simple act of attention. So it was for me a chance to zoom in, put the spotlight on a poet who maybe many in India were unaware of. You know, there was some Malayalam poet whom almost no one knew of, some Odia poet whom no one knew of. Focusing, honoring them by putting their bibliography of that time together, sometimes interviewing them, presenting the poems, offering a sightline through which to view their work. So I like to believe that is its legacy. And personally, when I'm approached that way, it moves me, it touches me. When someone has taken the effort to read deeply, it moves me, because that's really what we're trying to do as poets, right? You're trying to create an utterance that will touch people somewhere deep inside them, not simply, be today's Instagram post that washes by you, washes over you and you forget about it. You don't want to just create that. So, it was a wonderful project. I'm deeply grateful for it. At some point, I think maybe an anthology needs to come together, putting all of that together. Maybe
what I respect the most about that is that when you had the translated poets, the original language is also presented on the website, and it's that is preserved.
Yes, absolutely. And in some cases, the poets' voices as well, that
yes.
we did later. Yeah.
Yes. You should go back to doing that. I would vote for that.
Maybe it's something to think about. I still remember Keki Daruwala sitting in my office at the NCPA. I was trying to record his poem. This was with primitive technology, really. But I was trying to record him reading. And there'd always be someone coming into that library. And I'd have to say, no, get out. And poor Keki read, I think, 3 times to make that recording happen.
And then speaking of another collection that you anthologized, and this will be my last question on anthologies, because I really want to talk about your writing as well. But Eating God is one of my favorite collections ever. I think I go back to it very often, and there's so many moments that I just sit still with a poem. And what you were talking about, that poetry, that a poet wants to be read but also remembered. I think that's what really happens with really good poetry, is that it stays with a person, no matter the language. And is that I'm curious, as an editor, is that what compelled you to put together the Bhakti anthology, because they stayed with you, these poems, or what was that?
Hmm. Talking of poems that stay with you, I must say that many of the Bombay poets whom we talked about earlier, lines from their poems stay with me simply because I read them intensely. I
Yeah,
did at a point in time. So I think it's about how you read. That's what makes lines stay with you too. You have to read deeply, you
yeah,
know. That's one part of it. The other is that as far as bhakti is concerned, I'm so glad you mentioned Eating God, because
yeah,
in many ways I think it has been an important anthology
yes,
because it attempted to reframe the idea of bhakti. I growing up believed that bhakti was all about religiosity. I thought it was about, people sitting together at satsangs and just, being a bit mindless and a bit over emotional and overwrought. I saw it as somewhat sentimental poetry. I did
yeah,
not take it terribly seriously. And it was as my own spiritual journey evolved in a certain way and intensified that I realized that in the finest bhakti poetry, we don't have a bunch of servile individuals writing servile poetry. We have a really strong, passionate, argumentative, erotic relationship with God going
yeah,
on there. That's why we return to those poems. You don't have to be a believer to read those poems of
yeah,
any.
yeah,
I think that's what grabs me about them. The fact, and that's why Eating God ends with that last poem by Tukaram, translated by Dilip Chitre, yet another Mumbai poet, who says, in that beautiful poem, Tukaram says, "For me, God is dead." This
yeah,
is the same Tukaram who celebrates God and who
yeah,
yearns for God. Is also capable of saying, "For me, God is dead," and the two are not antithetical.
yeah,
This is what a legacy!
yeah,
What a legacy! That you can have this in the corpus of a single poet.
yeah.
A poet who can yearn for the divine and finally say, "I've had enough. Let me sit still. That's enough for me." So, for those who want to try and extract some sort of philosophy from it, I would just say there is none. This
Yeah,
is just a deep, intense, high voltage acknowledgement of the heart.
yeah,
Bhakti is a science of the heart.
yeah.
You know, that's what it is.
And what are the politics of saying this, of perhaps, putting together these really honest raw poems? Because it's written about, you've written about this, so many writers have written about how the bhakti poets came from disenfranchised castes, they came from communities that were not allowed inside temples, that, the idea of what is a bhakti poem. This is one other Bombay poet called Keshav Mishram, and he had this poem, Ek divas mi parmeshwarala aivarun shivi dili. One day I cursed that motherfucker God. And, some people read that as a bhakti poem. And considering the rise of, of right-wing nationalism and, politicizing religion, what are the politics of reading a truly irreverent bhakti poem?
I think you have to allow yourself to be disconcerted. I mean, well before this, Namdev has a poem, right back there in the 12th century, a major Maharashtrian poet who talks of, calls his God casteless and the son of a whore. And this is the sort of vocabulary you find in the poem. Let me say one thing, Saranya, though. Where I'm coming, the way I want to reframe bhakti is not sensationalizing something for its own sake.
Mm.
What is important to me also to acknowledge is that these are people with a very deep thirst for the sacred, whatever that is. They define the sacred differently. For some, it is with a name and form and address, and for some, it is a formless sacred. Whatever it is, the thirst is real.
Mm.
So the politics are certainly implicit. Yes, many of them come from, it was the time when you heard the voices of many more people, not just the Brahmins, not just those who could read. It was incredible voices that were reclaiming their power and the power of a relationship with the sacred that was unmediated by pundits and priests and scholars. So it was very important in that regard. But what I also would not ever want to forget is that these are sacred poems.
Yeah.
So why I mention this is that there is a wonderful ability of the bhakti poet to argue with God. Many
Yeah.
of them argue with God, or they hurl all these expletives at him. Some of them do.
Mm.
At the same time, they never stop loving him.
Yeah.
And I think this is the important equipoise that for me is something I hope we are able to reclaim for ourselves culturally. You don't have to be contemptuous of something in order to critique it. You need to love it. I mean, these guys never stopped loving their
Yeah,
gods. You
yeah,
could also argue with them. And that's the ethos that I would like to uh, I would like to see them foster. I would like these voices to remind us of that it's possible to argue and never stop loving. It has to be deeply rooted in love and compassion. I feel, unfortunately, we live in times when many of us have withdrawn into different kinds of gated colonies of the mind.
mm.
And there was a time think back on my own life, sitting in a university cafe and heatedly arguing with people whose politics were different from mine or whose aesthetics were different from mine. But it was a subject of conversation. You were still friends the next day.
Right.
It seems now that we have just turned, we sort of want to live in cubby holes. I
Mm.
can see why. But at the same time, I think for me, what is so wonderful is that the bhakti poets remind us that dissent is not disloyalty. And at the same time, dissent does not mean an absence of friendship. There is deep love in those poems.
Yeah. And the fact that their faith is secure enough for them to question and love at the same time.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I'm curious about, about mysticism, about music and dance showing up in your own poems. Do you find sometimes that you start that perhaps a sound inspires you to write a poem, or any other sense like a taste or or something that you see? What sometimes gets you started writing?
I don't know, Saranya, I suppose, yes. A line I would trust is a line that feels crunchy in
Mm,
some way. It should not just be a pallid line. It has to feel like something you want to sink your teeth into. So certainly the sensorial is important in a line. If I want to follow it and see where it leads me, I would look for something that has texture, that has um, succulence,
yeah.
So that's one part of it. The other is so much of it also comes to us. You can hear the sirens of New York in the
Yeah.
background. I'm sure those will permanent poems at some point. I do have sirens in one of the poems, I know. But conversations too. And a lot of my conversations, since you mentioned music and dance, because the performing arts have always been an important part of my life, theater, classical dance, music, I think a lot of my own understanding of the creative process has come to me through my conversations with artists of other disciplines, not
Yeah.
necessarily through poets. Poets too, but many, many other disciplines. I've been very nourished by them. So I'm sure that enters the work in some way. I think back and I think of all the live artists I was privileged to know, so many that one learned from. I'm thinking of Mumbai, but I'm thinking of people like Vijay Mehta, Satyadev Dubey in theatre, Shanta Gokhale, people who were deeply engaged with the cultural scene of the city and of the country, who were deeply engaged in their art, whatever it was, or in art criticism.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of dancers like Chandrelekha or Aladmail Balli, who thankfully is still very much a very, very, very close friend and collaborator, and a magnificent dancer. I think of so many conversations, musicians, Aruna Sairam, Bombay Jayashree, so many, and also
Yeah.
my contemporaries, artists like Shanaz Patel and Anaita Oberoi, Vikram Kapadia, many, many. So I feel very grateful for conversations with practitioners. There's always a certain juice about that.
Yeah.
That's probably part of my Bombay experience as well, but equally, I'm sure that leaks into the poems.
When you say leaks, I can't help but I always remember that line from one of your poems, Language Leaks. And you were talking about a line being crunchy, and that's when you feel like it can be written down. There are so many of your lines that have stayed with me. Language leaks, I renounced shape a long time ago. Not yet that shock of vacancy. And again, one other one on language begins to peel away from you. I find that there was, and these are all from your collection, When God is a Traveler. I find that so
Yes.
much of it has to do with um occupying space or being a vessel, or which again reminds me of bhakti poetry, or just language dancing and sounding very alliterative, very rhythmic and very musical. um what what is your writing process like when do you feel satisfied with a poetic verse?
That varies from poem to poem, doesn't it, Saranya? I think what I do very often is to write and put away what I write so that I forget all about it. I make sure I forget about it. I veil it, which is why I believe this act of veiling, even from the self. Certain mystery is important in the process of creation. You allow for mystery and then you unveil again and look at it. And if there is a moment of deep recognition, almost the shock of recognition,
Yeah.
you know that you have something in place that works, even if you don't quite know why at that second or third or 17th reading.
Yeah.
If there is that shock, you retain it. And you peel away a lot of the superfluity. That's also part of the process. You keep peeling and putting away, adding and putting away. And it's probably through that process that a poem happens. When God is a Traveler, because that's the book you mentioned, that emerged from a very tumultuous phase in my life.
Oh.
Many changes on many levels.
Yeah.
I was leaving the city, I was leaving my work, I was leaving a relationship. At the same time, I was ambushed by a spiritual journey. I use the word ambush because it was the first time I began to understand what the bhakti poets were talking about. And the poets I love most, Nammalvar, one of them, many of the others, speak of ambush. Manika Vachakar, they speak of ambush. And I completely get it because that's how it felt to me. So a lot of the work that emerged at that time, including Eating God, the anthology you mentioned, and When God is a Traveler, which was my own book of poetry, emerged from a sense of dismantling, things crumbling around me, and a dark sense of elation. There was great excitement and wonder and a kind of exhilaration. There were ashes, but there was also exhilaration in that book. I think that's the texture of that book.
What I really felt while reading that book was that it was kind of balancing themes of intangibility, all that is intangible, all that we cannot hold on to, but at the same time, so much that is physically around us. And I felt like it was kind of straddling both. So I guess it makes sense when you say that you wrote it where all of these changes were happening in your life.
I was understanding bhakti in a way that I never had before. I was understanding my own heart, let's put it that way, in a way that I never had before. I thought that one could embark on a spiritual journey by sidestepping the heart, just happily occupying some serene part of the cerebrum where I would be insulated from the turbulence of my own interiority. And I realized that wasn't the case and could never be the case. And there is no spiritual journey worth its salt that allows you to sidestep any of this.
You have to go through it. You were speaking about conversations earlier with other artists, and I wonder, this one poem that's called Hierarchies of Crisis, which it says that you've written for Jerry. Was that also the result of conversation? How did that poem come about?
You mentioned it a while ago, and I'd actually forgotten the poem, but I looked at it. I do remember You're absolutely right. There must have been conversations, and I think certainly Jerry and I have had long conversations about the ways in which we create hierarchies of suffering. And this is often the case of, I think, a particular brand or a particular tribe, not all, but a particular tribe of sanctimonious academic who comes up with a very naive, very jingoistic understanding of sociology, and who therefore believes that if you speak or if you articulate your own personal experience, you are in some way your own subjectivity, all that goes with it. Your pain, your pleasure, what makes you you. there is often a tendency to say, no, that is of little consequence because you are privileged, you are upper caste, you are upper class, you are male, you are all of those things. So to me, that is, trying to guilt people out of their pain is never going to work, is it? And I don't think that that's the way ahead at all. I mean, if we really want to be surrounded by a world where people are morally vigilant and politically active and spiritually aware, we can't guilt people out of their pain. So I think it was looking at those hierarchies that are created often by the world outside us, but which we have to resist. There is nothing, absolutely nothing, that is in any way trivial about your subjective experience. It is only by exploring your subjectivity that breakthroughs happen. If you stop living in these cubbyholes that says, now I've put on my political hat, now I've put on my, economic analyst hat, now I've put on my current affairs hat, that's not how poetry works. Poetry emerges from that vast, unmapped subjectivity from which, we allow things to surface and we see where it leads us. That's where it came from. I was looking at that poem again just earlier and thinking about it. I think Jerry and I often discussed that. That was before his book, M and the Big Home.
Oh, really?
So, well before that. I mean, Jerry was writing that book forever. But when it came out, it was a book that was into which decades of work had gone in.
But when God is a Traveler won a Sahitya Academy Award, it won the Khushwant Singh Prize. What does it feel like when prizes are associated with your name and awards are associated with your writing?
For that book, I was very grateful, and I mean, I'm grateful for awards, but I think that book particularly because, as I said, it emerged from a place of such transition in my life, and to be honest, that transition has only intensified. But there have been shifts. I would map my journey a bit differently from the time I mapped it in that book. It won, what was not lovely for me, let me say, it also won the Piero Begonjari Award in Italy, which I was delighted. And it was the season choice of the Poetry Book Society and was shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot Prize. That was important to me because I'd grown up, I remember the first time I read T.S. Eliot. I was 12 or 13 or something in my grandfather's home in Chennai, and I remember first encountering Eliot. My first article in the Times of India when I was 20 was on T.S. Eliot and the way in which it was taught. So there was a certain congruence there. Awards are a way of feeling in some way heard. And that is their value, that you are heard.
Yeah.
I think many of us grew up, I certainly grew up feeling largely, though I had, yes, I was a reasonably bright kid at school. I was, I knew I was loved at home, but I don't think I felt heard and heard for who I really was. And an award is some way of saying, okay, in our own way, we've heard you, that helps. It is in some way affirming.
It's very much deserved. I really do believe that. I absolutely love that collection. And I also want to know about, am I correct in saying that your most recent book is The Gallery of Upside Down Women, or is that not the most recent one?
The most recent. It is, you're absolutely right.
Yes, correct. Tell me about that. How did that book come together?
That book happened because, the past decade really, or maybe the past 8 years, I've spent my time doing nothing but reading the women mystics, the women mystic poets, particularly trying to archive many in the Indian subcontinent, whose work has, to my mind, just turned into, it's been prettified and sanctified and in ways that are not always complementary to the poets. I wanted to be able to smell the danger in those poems again. So the anthology that I edited last year, Wild Women, is a compendium of women mystics. But this book has been, in the works for a long time. So I realized, Saranya, what has happened is an inadvertent trilogy. It was not planned that way, but perhaps it was inevitable because I was submerged in this work for a very long time. The trilogy is Wild Women, which is an anthology that I've edited, of women mystic poets down the ages. a book of prose that intercepted my journey somewhere along the way, about 4 contemporary women on spiritual journeys.
Yes.
That's called Women Who Wear Only Themselves.
Only themselves, yes.
Mm-hmm. It was out in India some years ago. It's just out here in the US now. And there is my own poetry, and that's the most recent book. It's called The Gallery of Upside Down Women. It's just out in the UK. It should be out here in the US later this month, and in India later this year. The Gallery of Upside Down Women, what do I say? Those crazy women mystics started permeating my life. So they entered the writing. And I see it like this. I see them as freedom songs. There are lots of dramatic monologues, attempting to channel the voices of some of these women who just astound me.
Yeah.
So that's part of it. But I see them as songs as freedom. And I see them particularly today when we feel that the entire world is topsy-turvy. I think an upside down woman is actually right side up.
Yeah.
So I wanted upside down women there.
I'm excited to read it because I think what Eating God really helped me with, and what your bhakti poetry helps me with, is accessing bhakti in languages I wouldn't have been able to. And that's been really enjoyable for me because of my own limitations with language. So I'm excited to read this. I just have one.
So the most
sorry.
central metaphor say is a woman whom you probably have heard of, given your own background, Karekala Mayar, a woman who actually was upside down, we are told, at least in legend. So I like the idea of celebrating that kind of upside downness.
I was told her stories when I was a kid by my grandfather, and she was always the most fascinating character of all of them because she was upside down. And I found that hilarious when I was a child.
I know. And yet that's the kind of woman I like to, I think we need to be celebrating today.
My last question to you is, do you think about Bombay when you are away from Bombay? You are right now in New York. Do you think another city, work of writing, whether it's prose, poetry, nonfiction, is going to come out from you?
I have no clue. But do I think about Bombay? Yes. I walk its streets very often when I'm just daydreaming, and I walk its streets in my dreams. So it's the backdrop to my life, if not the protagonist at times, but it's often the backdrop. And the difference is now I feel a little more capable of saying I'm not just a product of Bombay. I'm not just a victim of Bombay. I'm not just a survivor of Bombay. I'm one of the many participants. Mm-hmm. And I think all of us are, and we need to also retrieve that aspect of our identity, in relation to the city, that the city is what it is because we are who we are.
Yeah.
And in some infinitesimal way, we make a difference. Yeah. So when I think of the city like that, I feel I'm one of the city's many rightful owners.
I love that. I love that everyone who is in the city feels like a rightful owner. And that always reminds me of Arun Kolatkar's poem Pie Dog, in which he says, the most intelligent life on this planet. I return the city to its so-called masters in the morning.
Yes. The Pie Dog knows better.
Pie Dog knows.
Who the masters really are.
Yeah. But thank you so much, Arundhati. I don't have any more questions, but I'm very excited for your book to come out. Will you come to India for a launch?
I hope so. I hope to do it later this year, maybe September, maybe October. I'd love to. I'd love to share from it. And all the best with your writing, Saranya. I look forward to your book next year.
Yes.
And I'm glad we had this conversation. It's been wonderful to actually, this is strangeness, isn't it, about sitting here in one mad metropolis talking about another.
I know.
It's strange and at the same time perfectly apposite. So thank you.
Yes, thank you so much.